Decades ago, I started growing food in my front and backyard, and I realized that my mission in life is to inspire and empower others to grow their own nutrient-dense, healthy organic food. Because of this, a lot of people have come to me with their gardening questions over the years, and that got me thinking, what if we put together a community that would help budding gardeners blossom? So I finally made the idea a reality with my Urban Farm U member program. Each month, your membership includes 3 live online events, a monthly class, a chit-chat with an expert, and a monthly coaching session, plus access to the experts on our member page and a significant discount on our signature courses. I'm deeply committed to transforming our global food system, and I do this by empowering you to grow your own food. The Urban Farm membership program is a simple way to get going. Please join me in transforming your food system today. To learn more, go to urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444. That's urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444.
You're listening to the Urban Farm Podcast, your partner in the Grow Your Own Food revolution. Whether you've just been introduced to urban farming or you're a lifelong advocate, we're sure you'll leave feeling more informed, equipped, and empowered to dig deeper into the soil of your local food economy. With you every step of the way, here's your host, Greg Peterson.
Today on the Urban Farm Podcast, we have Sean Quinn of HOK San Francisco to talk about his experience with vertical farming and city planning. Sean leads the sustainable design practice of HOK San Francisco, a global design, architecture, engineering, and planning firm. He's responsible for coordinating services across the firm's Pacific region. His approach to sustainable design is grounded in climatically tailored solutions that respond to the economic, environmental, and cultural context of cities. Sean complements his design practice with research in green building technologies, including, among other things, urban and vertical agriculture. Sean is a lecturer at Danube University, Krems, Austria, was an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong, and is a frequent lecturer at international universities and conferences. For the past several years, Sean has led research in urban and vertical farming and developed a prominent exhibition on urban ecology and biomimicry at the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennial of Agriculture and Urbanism. His research has been presented to key stakeholders at the United Nations, as well as for multiple international governments, diplomatic, private, and non-profit organizations. Sean believes that urban agriculture can provide a multifaceted solution to the health and resilience of cities while catalyzing community and economic growth. Welcome to the show today, Sean.
It's great to be here, Greg.
Yeah.
I'm happy to join the Urban Farm Podcast.
Thank you. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at now?
Yeah, sure thing. So my background is actually architecture. I have about 13 years of professional experience working across North America, Europe, Middle East, Asia, and I've wrapped my way back around to San Francisco. So I've done a little bit of a world-round trip over the course of the past several years. But the more that I've sort of built into my career, the more I've sort of focused a little bit more on sort of the interaction between what we call the sort of the built environment, the sort of urban sphere that we're obviously building up against the natural one. And that kind of form and understanding and exploring the issues of climate change, energy use, and interestingly now, sort of what's known as sort of the energy, water, food nexus. In order to generate any of the resources that we all need to do both the industrious and just survivalistic things, it takes a lot of resources. And to be honest, food and farming is becoming increasingly important of an issue.
No kidding. So you mentioned an interesting term, energy, water, food nexus. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, sure thing. So in order to generate, a single watt of energy, it actually takes about a gallon of water.
Oh, interesting.
And so anytime, whether it's, burning coal and essentially you need to use water to sort of cool the engines in there, if you're generating, solar thermal energy, there's a lot of water that's sort of being evaporated off. You look at really large-scale solar systems, it's concentrated and uses steam. So anytime, whether through fossil fuel or renewable energy, we're generating power, we're actually using up a lot of water. And that obviously has a reciprocal impact, that it's water being taken away from our food.
Something else, yeah.
And so all of these things that we do to sort of live in the modern lifestyle that we have takes away from those three parts. And we need to find a better way in order to actually balance them. And that's a possible thing to do, to actually take some of that water and refeed it into the ground, take some of the energy that we're using in our buildings and use that essentially and recapture that. Store that back into heating water that's then going back out into systems that could be recycled and reused into food. So when you finish drinking water out of the tap, what's to stop it from going to a garden outside of your house?
Yeah. Here in Arizona, we call that gray water use. So
exactly.
So you work for one of the bigger architectural firms in the country, dare I say the world?
Yeah, HOK is sort of one of the 10 largest design firms in the world, and we're the largest architectural engineering firm in the U.S.
Interesting. So why are you interested in urban agriculture?
So this actually started about, I'd say, 3 to 4 years ago. I moved from Washington, D.C. to Hong Kong and joined an international practice based there, and was also teaching at the University of Hong Kong. I was invited very early on to participate in sort of a public exhibition on urbanism and architecture called the Hong Kong Shenzhen Bi-City Biennial. And everyone that's entering into that is trying to take a look at what's the future of cities look like. And some people are doing it from the aspect of sort of industrialism or social engagement. We started looking at it just in terms of ecological footprint. And as I was brand new to Hong Kong, it made a lot of great sense to try and understand the history of Hong Kong's development. It's the tallest, densest city in the world, and you kind of just assume energy is going to come up as the number one, source of, ecological consumption.
Right.
And I was pretty shocked to find it was number 2. Food consumption was the number 1 source of carbon emissions and overall ecological use in Hong Kong. And so you kind of look at a city like that, and you have to then, ask a very, in-depth question of, exactly why. And it's the essence that Hong Kong, going back to the 19th century, was rice paddies, 80% agricultural land, a mix of rice and a little bit of opium. If you go deep into the history of Hong Kong, you understand some of the opium trade and wars that happened there as a result of it. But as sort of post-World War II, when the sort of more Chinese immigrants, because they're coming into Hong Kong, they started to actually cultivate the land further, to the point at which in the 1960s, Hong Kong was generating between 2/3 and 3/4 of its own food, which is pretty solid for any kind of large-scale international city.
Right.
But it became a big international trade and banking city, and urban expansion started happening really quickly there. That over the course of literally only 50 years, they've gone from being, let's say 75% self-sufficient to only 2%.
Oh my gosh.
Meaning that they only generate enough food for about 1 week a year. Also means that if there were to be a natural disaster, and Hong Kong gets hit by typhoons a lot,
right.
If you weren't able to bring flights in, if there was any damage to some of southern China as well, and cause issues with that, we'd only have food for about 72 hours before we started going into the non-perishables. So you start understanding and thinking about the essence of sort of food resiliency, and so you have to ask, why? Where is all the food coming from? Why is it coming from so far? And Hong Kong imports, from about 65 countries on a daily basis.
Oh my gosh.
It wastes about 3,500 tons of food, which is the equivalent of 8 million people going out and buying a double quarter pounder with cheese meal and throwing it in the trash.
Yeah.
So we're bringing in a lot of food. It's going through, these rapid flash freeze cycles. There's obviously the tremendous amount of resources, whether it's coming from New Zealand or France or the U.S., the emissions to bring it on a flight, to bring it into Hong Kong, it goes into another fridge, it goes to a distribution center, and then eventually ends up on someone's table. If you open up a package of spinach and you don't finish it, it's, done the next day.
Right.
And there's about 700 hectares of farmland left in Hong Kong, and there's some really good food being grown on it. But going back 5 years or so, it wasn't really trusted, and it wasn't really being cultivated very much. It's sort of being looked at as a sunset industry. But with this need and real issue of rapid urban expansion, you start understanding a little bit more about how do we begin to protect those 700 hectares of farmland. How do we try and sort of instill that within some of our urban areas? And you start digging deeper and deeper. There's all of a sudden you realize there's this great social movement of people that are growing urban farms throughout the city. There are over, I think, 25 urban farms right now, private urban farms on the rooftops of Hong Kong. The tallest farm in the world is on top of the Bank of America Tower, so about 50 stories up, so probably around 600 feet up in the air is a farm that's growing mint, basil, pak choy, as well as large yams.
Wow.
So you start having kind of question, what could we do with this? And that was sort of what started striking my sort of interest in how does that begin to relate to architecture.
Yeah. Wow. So I want to dig a little deeper here, and I want to know why HOK is interested in urban agriculture.
Sure. So on an annual basis, HOK does a lot of both land use planning, new building architecture. In total, our master planning group sort of plans out about the size of the state of Connecticut on an annual basis.
Wow.
So if you can imagine that being replicated every single year across the world, and we're one big firm, there are other firms doing that. The amount of impact that we have on the natural environment is pretty huge. And so it's one part of responsibility. How can we better sort of understand some of the ecological resources that are out there and try and actually protect them?
Yeah.
But then it also feeds into resiliency. There's a lot of ecological resources that are out there that we typically kind of, clear sweep and then engineer. Most of the time, if we actually work with a lot of the ecological systems that are already in place, we don't need to do that. And so our planning group really tries to focus on how best to maintain a lot of those corridors. And then for our buildings, we're really trying to focus on a lot of the things that make our cities and places where we live and work a lot more healthy. So what does it mean to actually be able to have, food grown in or around your office building? So what kind of communal engagement does that begin to spark? How do we actually create sort of what we call a biophilic environment, one that sort of helps reaffirm our natural affinity to the environment by having food growing around us all the time?
Cool. So you used a couple of words that I want you to laser in on for me. Resiliency. Sure. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so in its truest definition, resiliency is the ability to sort of adapt to and sort of respond to any kind of inclement forces. So we measure that in a couple different ways. The first one, sort of urban resilience or climate change resilience, it's really looking at sort of the large-scale factors that we'll have to deal with in San Francisco in terms of big earthquakes, in Hong Kong, typhoons. So how do we make sure that we build cities that are able to withstand some of those pieces? The other part of it starts getting into actually some of the sort of social resilience, and that is that we want to make sure that people are extremely productive, and that is best done through creating healthy environments, through better community engagement, social equity, and that creates sort of a more of a interpersonal bond, and that resilience is extremely important to the growth of cities as a cultural place.
Beautiful. So you're, as a company and personally, you're working in the vertical farming arena.
Well, we're both urban agriculture and vertical farming, but the vertical farming is what I'm really sort of keen to dive deeper into.
Great. Yeah. Tell us about that and how it relates to the future growth of cities.
Sure thing. So vertical farming is really relevant because if you were to look at all of the rooftops in any city, even if you were to cover all of them with urban farms, you probably only generate between 10 to 15% of the food that's needed for that city. And so what vertical farming does is it sort of gives us a better floor to growth ratio. We can use aeroponic, hydroponic, or aquaponic systems, stack them on top of each other, repurpose parking garages, old existing buildings, and so basically densify the amount of sort of agricultural growth that can actually happen in a per single acre. And that ratio becomes something along the lines of 8 to 10.
Wow, 8 to 10 times.
Yeah.
So basically you're 3Ding food growth.
That's exactly right.
So what is the role of design in advocating for and designing of urban agriculture in cities?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think, on the very obvious surface level, we've got great landscape architects who understand the kind of plant species flora that grow in any region, utilizing that to best grow both food and sort of large oxidizing plants in the sort of exterior environment is really great. But what we're trying to understand now is actually how does that not only go in the exterior environment, but how does it come actually into the building? And so both from the industrial design of those systems, how would that actually sit into a building so that it's fully functional, it's free of pests, it's able to grow in a really quick and sort of easily maintainable way, but then also provide some form of interaction, right? There's a real neat opportunity that we can become, in many ways, going back to sort of a much more vernacular state of really understanding when and where our food is coming from.
Why is that important?
Well, I think it's important for a couple of different reasons. Number one, the more that we're aware of how much resources go into something, the more that we're likely to be engaged in it. The secondary piece is that there's sort of a natural proclivity that we have to nature, and when we work in these really large sort of closed-off office buildings without views or access to the outside, there's sort of a natural tendency to get what we call a sick building syndrome, or people to become depressed. So having that sort of closeness to it obviously sort of engages and enlivens a person. But then the third part that I'm really sort of interested in is sort of the social experiment side of it. What happens if you bring food into the office place? Are people going to want to take care of that? Are people going to be more likely to then sort of sit down at the pantry at lunchtime, pick some of the tomatoes that are growing in their localized farm, salads together? How does it really try and cultivate that sense of community that we often can lose in cities?
What do some of your projects look like? If I was going to stand out in front of one of your projects, what would I see?
So one of the best examples we have is Eskenazi Hospital, which is, right, obviously from definition, a healthcare facility. It's both in-bed and out-bed, which means that people both come there for a single appointment, or they might be there for a surgery and be there for several days. When you're recovering, you walk out onto the rooftop, and there is basically, I think, 2 to 3 acres of farmland that you can sort of walk through on the rooftop of this building. And so a great space to sort of be joined into. We've got several projects where you obviously have beautiful landscaping happening at the ground level, and then it kind of actually pulls up the side of the wall. And so you have sort of vertical gardens that are sort of floating up and sort of tacking onto the outside of a building. And then it actually moves onto the top of the building. We have a few projects in design right now where we're actually trying to sort of see if by building a structure, we're actually increasing the amount of green space. What that means is if we actually keep our first floor a little bit small and perhaps the building expands as it gets a little bit higher, or that by creating a series of what are called sky gardens on intermittent floors and balconies, we might actually have more natural space than if that building wasn't there at all and it was just a flat park.
Sky gardens, what does that look like?
Sky gardens can look like anything from sort of your typical outside garden bed, just sitting right outside of your window on the 13th or 25th floor. And what normally happens on especially any high-rise buildings, you have to have what's called a refuge floor every 20 to 25 stories. It means that if there's an earthquake or anything else, elevators and stairs bring everyone to that floor, and so that it's a overstructured zone.
Oh, interesting.
What we often do with those spaces is that they're not really used for 99% of the time, right? They're only used in case of emergency. So why not use that as an amenity during the other times of its existence? And so that means any, let's say, restaurant that's on the lobby floor can actually be growing any food that it needs right there on that garden. People that are in a hotel that you could actually have sort of your pool amenity deck, but then walk out and actually sort of see, about a acre of green space, lush gardens growing out there. So a lot of the same amenities that we get when we want to go to a resort outside of the city, right? We're typically used, if you were to go to anywhere in the Caribbean or Hawaii, we expect to sort of see these lush gardens splaying outside of our front door. But what would happen if we actually just extended, that slab a little bit outside of the building, whether it's a balcony deck you can actually access, it's just a garden. We bring that experience into our city.
Wow. Wow, you have a lot of passion behind this.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting topic.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that.
My passion for this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in any state of architecture, we deal with two different things. We deal with clients on a daily basis who are trying to execute a single building, and the longer that you work, the more that you come across unique issues or challenges or problems that you maybe don't always face. And so I have the sort of unique fortune in my role that we do a good research. We sort of, kind of pull through, and such as a big architecture firm, there are a lot of challenges that we don't always solve on a regular project. So I get the real opportunity to sort of look at, what if you took away some of the economic limitations, building code limits, and just sort of said, how do we better address this? Mm-hmm. And typically what I call sort of this like future 2030 visioning. What are we trying to do in our buildings in the next, 15 to 20 years? And we exercise that, and then we kind of go backwards from there. And so then we do begin to understand the economic impacts, the permitting impacts, social issues that may come up or might be solved. And so as we slowly move through all of our projects over that next time period, mm-hmm. we can begin to sort of inch our way to this.
Wow. So this is a deep design process you're participating in.
Yeah.
It's not something that happens overnight. You've spent a lot of thought in making this happen.
Well, there's been a lot of research into the growth of cities to understand why this is such an issue. There's obviously a lot of risk, especially as cities continue to expand, that we lose a lot of the precious agricultural land. Oh, yeah. Some of that may be inevitable, and my key goal and vision is that if there's something has to be taken out, it needs to be relocated somewhere else just as good.
Right.
So if in order to build out a new airport train expansion and we need to cut through 2 acres of farmland, well, I want to see that farmland being replicated somewhere along that train corridor, because there are going to be new buildings going up.
Right.
How does that help conserve the economic status of those farmers? And so there's a lot of different issues that we have to tackle with this. It's not a simple, clear idea of just, this is going to look cool. It's really a multifaceted issue. But it comes up with multifaceted solutions as well.
Oh, yeah. So have you seen the work of Paolo Solari?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I was down at Arco Santi actually earlier this year for the first time.
No, very good, because he talks a lot about building out cities along rail lines, and then the farther away you get from the rail line, that becomes the agricultural land. Right.
That is sort of the traditional way of looking at city growth.
Yeah.
But I don't think anyone from the 1950s and 60s, when Paolo Solari was really focused on his work, could imagine the growth of cities as we see it now in 2015.
Yeah.
Right now we're seeing there are going to be 150 new cities emerging from villages throughout Asia. And so the growth of urbanization right now is higher than it's ever been in human history.
Yeah.
And so we don't, and as well as we're also keenly aware of the amount of resources that it takes to move from farmland in the Midwest out to our coast. And then obviously as well, as people become more interested in different types of food and their culinary appetites expand, how much that food then comes from even further away via flights. Yeah. All of that resource use isn't sustainable long term.
Right.
And we also view farming as something that obviously in certain regions of the world, America actually being a great one, it's actually a very booming industry, but there's obviously a lot of farms that really struggle with being close to cities and being pushed out. So trying to look at how we can sort of bridge that gap, I think, is an important one, both from a resource standpoint, a social standpoint, and then sort of, uniquely as an experiential standpoint.
Yeah. So talking about bridging the gap, you're in California and really working on now the urban agriculture movement in California. What relevance does it have, all this work that you've done in California?
Yeah, well, so I'm, been about 6 months into California, so we're sort of gearing up for this work now. In Hong Kong, I was really focused on the lack of access to land. In California, it's becoming the lack of access to water.
Of
California, quite frankly, has been the breadbasket for the U.S. for a lot longer than it can possibly stand to be.
Yeah.
But it has a rich, history of it. There's a phenomenal sort of closeness to the land that I find, at least the people in San Francisco, really still have.
Oh, yes.
and people are really attached to and keenly aware of their their diets, where food goes. I can't tell you how many times I hear people, they start their Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, more so than any other place I've ever lived.
Yeah.
And so we obviously don't want to lose that. It's something that people really cherish here. But we obviously are over-consuming from the land that we've been given. So I think that urban agriculture here is going to play a little bit of a different role. Between San Francisco and San Jose, we obviously have a lot of tech companies that are booming up in places that used to be sort of apple and peach orchards. And so how do we preserve the land that's already there? How do we integrate some of that into those new developments and sort of unearth the lost resources that have been sort of plowed over by highways?
Yeah.
And I think what we can regain is that the closer you actually have farming to buildings, the more access you have to water. As people in residential buildings are going to be, drafting out water, we need to get more use per single gallon. We can't just, drink water and that be it. We need to actually make sure that anything we don't, pull out of that tap is being used again for something else.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of gray water recycling, as you mentioned earlier. And what we want to do is try and make sure that we don't waste a single drop.
Right. Perfect. So I came across you because there's a conference in San Francisco. It's called the Microdesk BuildingSuccess event, November 10th at SPUR. I guess that's an acronym, Building a Sustainable Future in the Bay Area with Urban Agriculture. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure thing. So SPUR stands for the San Francisco Planning and Urban Revitalization. They're essentially a think tank that deals with a multitude of sort of issues around urban design. Everything from climate change resilience to seismic issues, as well as a good focus on urban agriculture. So the event that we're having that we're sort of partnering with Microdesk on is really trying to sort of engage the architectural engineering and construction community to sort of talk about that. So SPUR is going to be talking a little bit about the sort of history of agriculture in the area here. A gentleman named Eli, who's sort of their director in urban food policy. We have another expert from agritecture, as well as the Association for Vertical Farming, Henry Gordon Smith, and he's sort of been, now gone from ankle to neck deep in all of the sort of advanced agricultural technologies that are coming out to make this sort of possible. And my role in this is sort of trying to sort of see, well, how can we sort of take both the sort of need that's uniquely to the Bay Area, as well as sort of the viable technologies, both sort of economically and sort of location context-based, and begin to start focusing on how we can integrate that into our projects and the urban growth of the area.
Perfect. So that is the Microdesk BuildingSuccess event. It's November 10th. It's called Building a Sustainable Future in the Bay Area with Urban Agriculture, and we will have a link for that on the show notes page. So what's next? What steps need to be taken with urban agriculture and vertical farming so that it becomes more widespread?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first piece, and this is where Microdesk is really great, is just general awareness. They do a great job of advocating both for the issues in the built environment as well as the opportunities for general innovation. The next piece for everyone else is, obviously, as we begin to talk about this, is to sort of connect the sort of multifaceted opportunities that come from that. And as we've sort of talked about all of those right now, sort of water and energy, access to healthy food, communal engagement. We need to start sort of identifying the land out there in cities, making sure that every plot of land that could be used for community gardening could become linked through that. We need to we begin to beautify our parks in the city or develop new ones, understand and sort of see, is there an opportunity to actually integrate it there? But beyond that, as we begin to sort of start developing new office places, new workspaces where people are sort of, especially in the sort of, heart of tech country, becoming adaptive to sort of new experiences, how do we sort of see urban agriculture or vertical farming coming into the workplace as well?
Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to actually shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, pretty oftentimes I can, be accused of either being on the bleeding edge of things or on the cutting edge.
I resemble that remark.
So being on the cutting edge obviously means you're right on the pulse. Being the bleeding edge is perhaps being a little bit over egregious or stepping beyond it. And so very oftentimes, I think when these ideas first come up, you kind of tend to maybe ignore some of the practical pieces that need to go into it. And I've definitely been at fault of doing that, just being really passionate about sort of how do you just drive it forward. And, as a result, you don't necessarily end up with the sort of practical pieces that need to be implemented to engage that.
Yeah.
And so how do I overcome it? It's just simple learning that, every time we put out one of these ideas, whether it, succeeds or fails in that single instance, it's, what piece of the puzzle did you sort of pull out of that? What, part of the argument, was successful and, where did it fall short? Mm-hmm. If economics was the major issue, then we got to make sure that with the next client that we, to keep talking with them about it, that we really address that. If it's the essence of, complications and maintenance, how do we begin to adapt that? Mm-hmm. And so in the case of, urban agriculture and vertical farming now, we've kind of gone through a lot of that. The return on investment now for installing some of these smaller systems is only about 3 to 5 years.
Wow.
We've looked at the economic models of return by sort of really scaling this up, mm-hmm. That all of a sudden, an office space might, lose, say 3% of its leasable area, but the actual yield in terms of both, food and financial value goes up by the virtue of the fact that you can resell that food. And so I think different organizations and finding the right partners is what's key to sort of bringing that all together.
Yeah. So what do you consider your biggest success in this process?
I think it's just been it's really unique, isn't it, that sometimes before you begin to build something, you actually have to spend a lot more time dealing with the social and technical issues of it. Yeah. So in Hong Kong, when we did this exhibition, we were kind of just doing it out of sort of an essence of personal interest and research, a great opportunity to do some sort of outreach for our firm, and we didn't really expect much more to happen beyond that. And the big success that came out of that was how many people started ringing my phone. Nice. To the point at which, as many of our ideas, we envisioned this 400-meter tall vertical farm tower and sort of, created both the, design and business case and sort of ecological system case. What we were shocked by was that I got a call from the French Chamber of Commerce that the Hong Kong government was interested in developing a new city for 1 million people. And this is, urban growth in southern China.
Right.
And that basically the French government and the Hong Kong government were going through a technology exchange, which is a fairly typical thing that happens between governments when they're going into some major period of growth to try and basically help each other out. Mm-hmm. The French government's done a lot of things from aspects of, and this is going to go out of agriculture, district energy, district water, mixed modal transportation, waste management. And so the Hong Kong government was very receptive to all of that and brought the French government in to sort of, listen to their business and businesses and experts. But when they asked about urban farming, they didn't really have anyone that could, stand out in that realm. And so I got sort of invited into the conversation.
Nice.
The lone American in Hong Kong,
yeah.
With a lot of French businesses.
Yeah.
And that was a massive opportunity to then really shine a light on this issue. And I think, the biggest success I think I came away from this is that, it's very easy to sort of go into these processes a little bit antagonistic and protective. I'm trying to conserve something. And instead, I really started to try to approach it by what is the opportunity here? And inevitably, the growth of some of those cities would necessitate some loss of farmland. And my goal was to minimize that.
Yeah.
But really to look at how do you, sort of use that kind of lightning bolt of development to try and raise awareness of the issue of farming in Hong Kong. And we worked with the Hong Kong government to develop planning principles of how best to utilize that land, how to sort of create, social spaces around that. And then that just kept snowballing. Mm-hmm. I ended up speaking the next spring in 2015 for the first international summit of the Association for Vertical Farming in Beijing, China. Right? China's got 1.6 billion mouths to feed, and that's not an easy thing to do. And you've been cultivating rice for millennia. It's not the best thing for soils, and they've been growing their cities much faster. And so Beijing was fantastically interested in all of the ideas that these international experts were bringing in on vertical farming. I just kept going, where I've now talked with, obviously presented to the French Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, the British Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. I was invited by Microdesk to begin sharing some of these issues and begin looking at how do we repurpose infrastructure in the U.S., and did that at the National Press Club last fall. So I was able to speak at these multitude of events to begin talking about this sort of urban natural issues. And that really kind of, I think, culminated in one of my biggest sort of career highlights this past spring, where I actually got to talk about this at the United Nations.
I was going to ask you about that. Tell me about that.
Yeah. That's kind of one of those special phone calls you get.
Right, exactly.
The UN has, the end of 2015, had ratified, I want to say 17 new principles for sustainable development that they saw as sort of impacting, both developed and developing nations. And, the next piece of that is, how do you really put that in action? So they invited experts as they saw it from throughout industry. And that was everything from design to media, healthcare, the Internet of Things, commerce, to all come together and talk about how we can take some of those principles and those needs and start really, building businesses out of that. How do you make the business of doing something good really profitable?
Wow. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thanks.
Absolutely. So this great segue into our next question. What drives you? Why do you do what you do?
I think I am naturally prone to just reverse engineer things. I look for the things that we aren't quite doing well enough yet. And what are the gaps in between things? What are the transitions? And it's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. I like unique challenges that we haven't been able to solve, and especially those that really touch upon any piece of environmental benefit or sort of human wellness. Right. The more that we can sort of dive into that, the more that I just kind of start peeling away, and it's hard for my mind to stop diving into it. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're a bit of a what if kind of guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I do that too. I love pondering that question. What if we could do this, or what if we could do that? So yay.
Yeah.
So I'm all about education, and I have to know, is there one book that has been influential for you in this process?
Yeah, more recently, and this is one of those, I think, books I read before moving over to Hong Kong, was a book called Manhattan. It's a natural history of New York City, written by Eric Sanderson. He's got a great TED Talk. He's got a great TED Talk on it for those who don't have the time to read the whole book. But he's someone who basically does what's called geographic information services, travels the world and essentially looks at the resources and the sort of history of topography and urban development. His company's based in Manhattan, but he's doing this all over the rest of the world. And at one point, he decided to focus that lens back on New York City. And what you uncover by sort of digging deep back into history is that most of the resources that Manhattan needs, even as a city of 8 million people, it once had there. But through sort of ease of development and construction, right, we just sort of leveled it. New York used to be very hilly. It used to have aquifers right in the middle of it. And so there are a lot of resources that we don't pay attention to development of cities because we think of it as better, as you were saying earlier with Palo Solare. We say, well, that should be located elsewhere. Yeah. And to a certain extent, the more that we're now building and expanding new cities in places where only villages exist, we really need to take that into consideration. And at the same time, even within the cities that are already there, what's our opportunity to sort of unearth or sort of, revitalize some of those previous resources? Yeah. And I don't think I'd ever thought about it at that scale previously, right? You think about it as a little bit of a localized basis. When you actually kind of think about Manhattan as basically previously being really a farming, region. Oh, right. You don't even begin to think about the fact that the city that now populates, with 8 million people used to exclusively be farms and ports to bring in other food products. Wow. That's called Manhattan, A Natural History of New York City by Eric Sanderson. Yep. Fantastic. So what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners? Get involved. There are so many different forms of community farms that are just around the corner from you. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of social groups that are engaged in trying to understand or just sort of, try and cultivate this sort of notion of urban farming. There's a lot of people that need access to these resources, whether it's homeless shelters or, food drives. Get involved. I mean, it's just, it pulls at sort of a different place than we maybe normally think about on a daily basis, and I think it brings up notions that are sort of embedded in our psyche through millennia of human development that, inherently we are sort of one big tribe. Yeah. And so the more that we can share that, the better off we all are.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing your experience with us today, Sean. It has been a treat getting to chat with you.
Greg, it's been a pleasure speaking with you as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So the conference is the Microdesk Building Success event. You'll be speaking at it. It's November 10th. And like I said, we'll have a link on our site for that. And how can our listeners get a hold of you?
You can always reach me via email at sean.quinn@hok.com. That's sean.quinn@hok.com. Our website also sort of highlights a lot of the work that we have going on throughout the region. I also chair our corporate social responsibility group, HOK Impact. And so if you have any interest in some projects out there, whether you're a client of need or if not, we have teams that are really engaged to be locally tuned. So whether that's building a small farm for a school or building a school from scratch, we're here to help serve.
Far out. Thank you so much. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.
Decades ago, I started growing food in my front and backyard, and I realized that my mission in life is to inspire and empower others to grow their own nutrient-dense, healthy organic food. Because of this, a lot of people have come to me with their gardening questions over the years, and that got me thinking, what if we put together a community that would help budding gardeners blossom? So I finally made the idea a reality with my Urban Farm U member program. Each month, your membership includes 3 live online events, a monthly class, a chit-chat with an expert, and a monthly coaching session, plus access to the experts on our member page and a significant discount on our signature courses. I'm deeply committed to transforming our global food system, and I do this by empowering you to grow your own food. The Urban Farm membership program is a simple way to get going. Please join me in transforming your food system today. To learn more, go to urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444. That's urbanfarmmembership.org or text membership to 33444.